I still remember the moment my own daughter looked me in the eye and said she needed everything I had spent a lifetime building. Not help, not support, everything. And when I hesitated, she made it clear. If I did not give it to her, I would lose her and the child she carried. That was the moment something inside me broke. Not loudly, not all at once, but deeply enough that I knew nothing between us would ever be the same again. And that was the moment I made a choice that changed everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Ellis, and I am 68 years old. I have lived in Portland, Oregon for most of my adult life, in the same modest two-story house my husband and I bought more than 30 years ago. These days, it is just me. The rooms that once held laughter, arguments, and the everyday noise of a family have grown quiet in a way that feels both peaceful and heavy. My husband passed away 8 years ago, and since then, the house has settled into a stillness that sometimes comforts me and sometimes reminds me of everything I have lost. Most mornings begin the same way. I wake up early, before the sun fully rises, and make myself a cup of black coffee. I sit by the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood come to life in small, predictable ways. After that, I take my medications, carefully lined up in a weekly organizer, and move on to tending my plants. There are only a few of them, but I take pride in keeping them alive and healthy. It gives me a sense of purpose, however small. The best part of my day is when I step into the spare room I turn into a studio. The light there is soft and steady, perfect for painting. I am not a professional, and I never tried to be, but painting has become something I rely on. It is where I put thoughts I cannot quite explain into something I can see. Some days, I paint landscapes I remember from trips long ago. Other days, I paint nothing in particular, just colors blending into each other, reflecting whatever I happen to feel. Before I retired, I worked as an accountant for over 40 years. It was not exciting work, but it was steady and dependable, and that mattered to me. I learned early on to be careful with money, to plan ahead, and to never assume that tomorrow would take care of itself. Over time, I managed to save about $150,000. That money is more than just numbers in an account. It represents discipline, security, and the life I built one careful decision at a time. I have one daughter, Rachel. She is 40 now, living her own life not too far from here, though it often feels like she is much farther away. She works in real estate and seems to move through life with a kind of urgency I have never fully understood. We used to be closer, or at least I think we were. These days, our conversations are brief and usually tied to something she needs. I try not to dwell on that too much, but it leaves a quiet ache I have learned to live with. Sometimes I wonder where things shifted between us. I replay moments in my mind, searching for something I missed, some sign that might explain the distance, but I never land on a clear answer, and over the years, I have stopped asking the question out loud. For a long time, I have carried a quiet dream with me. My husband and I once talked about moving to Santa Fe, New Mexico. We imagined a slower life, surrounded by warm light and open space, where I could paint, and he could spend his days outdoors. We never made it there. There was always something else to take care of, something more urgent at the time. After he passed, the dream stayed with me, but I kept it tucked away, like something meant for another version of my life. From the outside, my life probably looks stable, even comfortable. Everything is in order, nothing out of place. But beneath that order, there is a stillness that has begun to feel less like peace and more like waiting. I did not know what I was waiting for, only that something, somewhere, was bound to change. If you're still watching and starting to feel the quiet tension building beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what changed everything in Chapter 2. That afternoon began like any other, quiet and predictable in the way I had come to depend on. I was in my studio, standing by the window with a brush in hand, watching the light shift across the canvas. The sky outside was pale and steady, and for a while, I let myself get lost in the rhythm of small, careful strokes. It was the kind of day that passed without urgency, where time seemed to move gently rather than forward. I did not hear the car at first. It was only when I noticed a shadow pass by the front window that I paused. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones even more so. When I stepped into the hallway and opened the door, I found Rachel standing there. For a moment, I did not recognize her. There was something off about her appearance that I could not immediately place. Her hair, usually styled with care, looked hastily pulled back. Her face seemed pale, almost drained of color, and there were faint shadows beneath her eyes that makeup had failed to hide. She held her arms close to her body, shifting her weight as though she could not quite stand still. She did not smile. I stepped aside to let her in without asking questions. Some instincts do not need explanation. In the kitchen, I moved automatically, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove. The small routines gave me something to hold on to while I tried to understand what I was seeing. Rachel sat at the table, but did not settle into the chair. Her fingers moved restlessly over the surface, tapping once, then stopping, then starting again. She avoided looking directly at me, her gaze drifting toward the window, the floor, anywhere but my face. When the tea was ready, I placed a cup in front of her and sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than usual, filled with something unspoken and waiting. Then she told me she was pregnant. The words landed softly, but their weight was immediate. I felt my breath catch, a brief pause between what I had expected and what I was now trying to process. A part of me felt a flicker of something warm, the distant idea of becoming a grandmother, but it was quickly overtaken by concern. I asked about the father, but her answer was vague, almost rehearsed in its lack of detail. She said the relationship had ended, that things had not worked out. There was no anger in her voice, no sadness either, just a flatness that did not feel natural. Something in me tightened. She did not speak about the baby in the way I imagined she would. There was no sense of wonder or fear or even confusion. Instead, her words began to move in a different direction. She talked about her apartment, how small it was, how unsuitable it would be for a child. Then she moved on to expenses, listing them one after another, as if reading from an invisible script. I listened, but a quiet unease began to grow inside me. The shift was subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. This was not a conversation about new life. It was becoming something else entirely. Then she looked at me, finally meeting my eyes, and said, "Mom, I need all your savings." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. The words seemed too large, too final to belong in the space between us. I felt something inside me go still, as though my thoughts had stepped back, unwilling to move forward. I did not respond right away. I simply sat there, looking at my daughter, and realizing that whatever this moment was, it was not just a request. It was the beginning of something I was not prepared for. If you're still watching, and that moment left you uneasy, like something deeper is about to unfold. Comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 3, where the first real conflict begins. I remained seated at the kitchen table, my hands resting lightly against the warm ceramic of my cup, though I had long since stopped drinking. Rachel's words lingered in the air between us, heavy and unmoving. I searched her face for something: uncertainty, hesitation, even regret. But what I found instead was expectation. She was waiting, not hoping. I chose my response carefully. There was no anger in me yet, only a quiet disbelief that needed to be steadied before it turned into something else. I told her I would help. Of course I would help, but not in the way she was asking. I explained that I could give her $15,000 to start, enough to ease the immediate pressure and give her time to adjust. For a brief second, I thought that might be enough. But the look on her face shifted almost instantly. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The tension in her shoulders hardened, and her eyes narrowed in a way that felt less like disappointment and more like judgment. What I had offered was not received as support. It was measured, weighed, and dismissed. She did not thank me. Instead, she began to speak again, her words coming faster now, sharper at the edges. She said it was not enough, that I did not understand how much things cost, how difficult her situation was going to be. There was a new tone in her voice, one that pressed rather than asked. It was no longer a conversation. It felt like a correction. I listened, but something inside me began to shift. I tried again, more gently this time, to explain my position. I told her that I had spent my entire life building that savings, that it was not just money, but the result of years of careful choices. I reminded her that I was not refusing to help, only setting a limit that felt reasonable to me. She did not respond to what I said, not really. Instead, she turned the conversation in a direction that left me unsteady. She spoke about the baby, about what it would mean to bring a child into the world without enough support. She framed the situation in a way that made my decision seem not just insufficient, but almost cruel. It was as if my boundaries were being translated into something colder than they truly were. I felt the sting of that. Then came the words that settled deeper than the rest. She questioned why I even needed the money at my age. She said I had already lived my life, that I was comfortable, that I did not have the same responsibilities anymore. There was no hesitation when she said it, no awareness of how it might sound. It was not anger that rose in me then. It was something quieter, heavier, a realization that moved slowly but with certainty. I looked at her differently after that. For years, I had explained away moments like this. I had told myself she was stressed, that she would grow out of certain patterns, that time would soften the edges between us. But sitting there, listening to her reduce my life to something already completed, I felt that explanation begin to fall apart. This was not a moment of desperation. This was how she saw me. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. Instead, I leaned back slightly, creating a small distance between us that felt larger than the space of the table. I began to understand that this was no longer about helping my daughter through a difficult situation. It was about being asked to give up everything I had built, without question. And for the first time, I was not sure I could. If you're still watching and you can feel how quickly things are escalating, comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 4, where the truth starts to surface. That night, long after Rachel had left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the faint ring her untouched cup had left on the table. The house felt different, as if something had shifted in its foundation. I tried to tell myself that what had happened was temporary, that stress had a way of distorting people. Pregnancy, uncertainty, fear. Those were heavy things to carry. I wanted to believe that was all this was. The next morning, I moved through my routine more slowly than usual. The coffee tasted the same, the light through the window unchanged, but I could not settle into the quiet the way I normally did. My thoughts kept circling back to Rachel, replaying every word, every expression. I found myself wondering if I had been too firm, if perhaps I should have offered a little more. Not everything, but more than I had. It was not about the money. That was what I kept telling myself. It was about keeping the connection between us from breaking entirely. I was still standing by the sink when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, asking to confirm details about a financial guarantee tied to my name. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but as the conversation continued, the pieces began to align in a way that made my stomach tighten. There was a property involved, a purchase agreement, and my name was listed as the guarantor. For a moment, I could not speak. I asked for clarification, though I already knew what I was going to hear. The representative provided the address, the timeline, and then mentioned Rachel's name. I ended the call with a quiet thank you and stood there, the receiver still in my hand long after the line had gone silent. The realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, like something sinking beneath the surface, too heavy to float. Rachel had already made her decision. She had moved forward without me, using my name as though it belonged to her. When she arrived later that day, I was already waiting. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her. I simply told her what I had learned and asked her if it was true. She did not deny it. She did not even seem surprised that I knew. Instead, she explained it in a way that felt almost practical, as if it had been the most reasonable step available to her. She said she had to act quickly. She said I would have agreed eventually. She spoke as though the choice had already been made for both of us. Something inside me went quiet. I realized then that this was not a misunderstanding. It was not a moment of poor judgment. It was a decision she had made with full confidence that I would follow behind it, no matter what it cost me. As if that were not enough, the calls began. Family members I had not spoken to in weeks suddenly had opinions about what I should do. They spoke about responsibility, about support, about how difficult things must be for Rachel. Their words were not harsh, but they carried a weight that pressed against me from all sides. By the time Rachel spoke again, her tone had changed completely. There was no hesitation left, no attempt to soften her words. She made it clear that if I did not give her the money, she would walk away. I would not be part of her life or the child's. I sat there listening and felt something close in around me. For the first time, I understood that this was no longer about helping my daughter. It was about how much of myself I was willing to lose. If you're still watching and that betrayal caught you off guard, comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 5, where everything reaches a breaking point. After Rachel left, the house did not return to quiet. It only became heavier. The silence pressed in on me, filling every room with something I could not ignore anymore. I moved from one space to another without purpose, touching familiar surfaces as if they might steady me, but nothing felt the same. I sat in the living room that evening, looking at the chair my husband used to occupy, and for the first time in years, I felt uncertain inside my own home. It was not grief that unsettled me. It was clarity trying to take shape, something I had avoided for longer than I wanted to admit. I began to replay everything, not just from the past few days, but from years before. The small requests that turned into expectations, the times I said yes because it felt easier than saying no, the quiet discomfort I pushed aside because I did not want to damage the relationship. I had told myself that love required patience, that support meant showing up no matter what. Now I began to see it differently. There had been signs, subtle at first, then harder to ignore, but I had chosen not to see them clearly. I had mistaken tolerance for kindness and sacrifice for love. Somewhere along the way, helping had become surrendering, and I had allowed that shift without ever naming it. The next morning, I made a decision I had been avoiding. I called a financial advisor I had worked with briefly before retiring. I told myself I needed clarity, something grounded in facts instead of emotions. When I arrived at his office, everything felt ordinary on the surface, but inside, I carried a quiet tension that would not ease. He reviewed what information I could provide, asking careful questions, guiding the conversation without judgment. It did not take long before the situation began to unfold in ways I had not expected, yet somehow already feared. Rachel was in debt. Not a small amount, not something manageable within our time and discipline, but a level of debt that spoke of long-term neglect and risky decisions. More than $80,000 spread across credit lines and obligations that had no clear path to resolution. Then came the part that settled deeper than the rest. The man she had been involved with, the one she described vaguely, was not who she claimed. He had a history of fraudulent activity tied to investment schemes, and according to what was uncovered, Rachel had reason to suspect it long before everything collapsed. She had continued anyway, or, at the very least, chosen not to face it directly. I listened without interrupting. The information did not shock me in the way it might have days earlier. Instead, it fit into place, aligning with something I had already begun to understand. This was not a sudden crisis. This was a pattern. I drove home slowly, letting the weight of it settle into something steady rather than overwhelming. By the time I walked through my front door, I no longer felt pulled in different directions. The confusion that had clouded my thoughts was gone, replaced by something quieter and far more certain. If I gave her the money, it would not solve anything. It would not fix the past, and it would not secure her future. It would only erase mine. For the first time, I understood that this was not a choice between money and family. It was a choice between losing everything I had built or finally protecting what was left of myself. And I knew, with a clarity that no longer wavered, which one I had to make. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, my eyes opening into a quiet that felt different from any other day. There was no heaviness in my chest, no lingering confusion. The thoughts that had kept me circling for days were gone. In their place was a stillness I had not felt in years, steady and certain. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, aware that something had shifted inside me in a way that could not be undone. I was not trying to decide anymore. That part was over. What remained was simple. I got out of bed and moved through the house with a sense of purpose that surprised me. Each step felt deliberate, as though I had already rehearsed them in some quiet part of my mind. In the kitchen, I made coffee out of habit, but I did not sit by the window as I usually did. Instead, I carried the cup with me as I began gathering what I needed. I started with my documents, bank statements, identification, insurance papers, anything that held practical value. I placed them carefully into a folder, making sure nothing was missing. When I logged into my account and saw the balance one last time, I did not hesitate. The number no longer represented safety in the way it once had. It represented a choice. At the bank, everything appeared ordinary. The same counters, the same quiet conversations, the same routine transactions happening all around me. When I told the manager what I wanted to do, there was a brief pause, a flicker of concern that passed across her face. She asked if I was certain, if I wanted to consider alternatives. I told her I was sure. The process took time. more than I expected, but I did not feel impatient. I stood there calmly, signing forms, answering questions, watching as the account I had built over decades was reduced to a final transaction. When it was done, I held the weight of it in a way that felt both physical and symbolic. I was not losing something. I was taking it back. When I returned home, I did not allow myself to drift into reflection. I moved directly into action. I pulled an old suitcase from the closet and began packing only what I needed: a few changes of clothes, my painting supplies, the small items that held meaning but not excess. The rest I left untouched. Furniture, decorations, things I had once believed defined a home now felt like anchors I no longer needed. I made a few calls, quiet and efficient. I arranged for the car to be sold, prepared to close accounts, and booked a one-way flight to Santa Fe. Each step felt cleaner than the last, as if I were removing layers of something that had weighed on me for years. Before I left, I sat at the kitchen table one final time and wrote a letter. The words came easily, without hesitation. I explained that I was leaving, that I had made my decision, and that I would not be providing the money she asked for. There was no anger in what I wrote, and no apology, just clarity. I folded the paper and left it where she would find it. At the airport, surrounded by strangers moving in every direction, I felt something I had not expected. It was not fear, and it was not relief in the way I had imagined. It was something quieter, something steadier. As the plane lifted from the ground, I looked out at the city growing smaller beneath me and realized that, for the first time in a long while, I was not acting out of obligation. I was finally choosing my own life. If you're still watching and you felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 7 and see what happens after walking away. When I stepped out of the airport in Santa Fe, the air felt different immediately. It was dry, warm, and carried a stillness that did not press against me the way silence had back home. The sky stretched wider than I was used to, uninterrupted and open, as if there was finally space for something new to begin. I was tired from the journey, but it was not the kind of exhaustion that weighed me down. It felt lighter, almost clean, as though I had left something behind that I no longer needed to carry. Still, beneath that, there was a quiet uncertainty. I had made a decision I could not undo, and while I did not question it, I was aware that I had stepped into something unfamiliar. The studio I rented was small but filled with natural light. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, and the space felt open in a way that allowed me to breathe more easily. I unpacked slowly, placing each item with intention. My clothes went into a narrow closet, my documents into a drawer, and my painting supplies were set up first, as though they mattered most. The first morning there, I stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight spill across the ground in a way I had only imagined before. There were no familiar sounds, no routines tied to memory. Everything felt new, and because of that, nothing felt heavy. I began to walk through the neighborhood each day, learning its rhythm. The streets were lined with small galleries, quiet cafes, and people who moved at a slower pace. No one seemed rushed. No one seemed to carry the same kind of tension I had grown used to. I found myself observing more than thinking, taking in details instead of replaying the past. But the past had not disappeared entirely. My phone began to fill with missed calls. Rachel's name appeared again and again, sometimes several times within an hour. At first, I silenced the notifications without looking. Then I noticed the voicemails piling up, each one representing another attempt to reach me. I did not listen to most of them. The few I allowed myself to hear were enough to understand the pattern. Her voice shifted from anger to frustration, then to something closer to desperation. There were accusations, questions, and eventually a tone that sounded almost unfamiliar, as if she was reaching for something she did not know how to express. I sat with the phone in my hand more than once, considering whether to respond. There was a part of me that felt the pull of habit, the instinct to fix, to answer, to step back into the role I had always played, but I did not. Instead, I placed the phone down and returned to what I had chosen. I spent more time painting than I had in years. The colors came more easily, the shapes less restrained. There was a clarity in my thoughts that I had not realized I was missing. Without the constant weight of expectation, my mind felt quieter, more focused. Still, there were moments when I thought of Rachel and felt a sharp, familiar ache. Not guilt, but something softer, something closer to sadness. I understood that she was struggling, that her situation was not simple or easy. But for the first time, I did not see that as something I had to solve. The silence around me had changed. It was no longer something I endured. It was something I had chosen. By the second week in Santa Fe, my days had begun to take on a rhythm that felt steady rather than unfamiliar. I woke with the sunlight instead of an alarm, letting the quiet warmth of the morning guide me into the day. My coffee tasted richer somehow, or perhaps I simply noticed it more. The studio had started to feel like mine, not just a place I was passing through. I spent long hours painting, often losing track of time completely. The work had changed without me consciously deciding it would. The colors were bolder, the lines less controlled, as if something inside me had loosened its grip. I found myself less concerned with how the paintings would be seen and more focused on how they felt while I created them. Occasionally, I ventured into the small galleries scattered throughout the town. I observed quietly, listening to conversations without joining them, taking in the way people spoke about art as something lived rather than something measured. There was a sense of honesty in that space that I had not experienced in years. It was during one of those afternoons that I received the call. The number was familiar, tied to someone I had consulted before I left Portland. I stepped outside to answer, the sun pressing gently against my shoulders as I listened. The voice on the other end was measured, careful, delivering information without urgency, but with precision. There had been developments involving Rachel. A legal issue had surfaced, tied to financial misrepresentation connected to the property she had attempted to secure. It was not just a mistake or oversight. There were questions being raised about intent, about documentation, about whether certain actions crossed into something more serious. I listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail as it was given. Then came something else, something that might have unsettled me more had I heard it weeks earlier. The man Rachel had described, the one she claimed was the father of her child, was not connected in the way she had suggested. There was another person involved, someone already tied to a separate life, a separate set of responsibilities. The story I had been given had never been complete. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, looking out across the wide, open landscape. The information settled into place quietly, without resistance. I did not feel the sharp shock I might have expected. Instead, it felt like a final piece aligning with something I had already begun to understand. Rachel had not just been overwhelmed. She had been making choices, one after another, each one building on the last. I walked back inside and sat near the window, letting the light fall across the floor in long, steady lines. I thought about everything I had learned, everything I had seen, and for the first time I felt no pull to intervene. There was no anger in me, no need to confront or correct. What remained was a clear recognition of where I stood in relation to it all. I was not responsible for the path she had taken. That did not mean I did not care. The concern was still there, quiet and present, but it no longer carried the weight of obligation. I understood now that helping someone did not mean removing the consequences of their decisions. I reached for my phone and held it for a moment, considering whether to respond, whether to open a door I had deliberately closed, but I did not act on impulse, not this time. Instead, I set it down and returned to my work. The canvas in front of me waited, open and unfinished, much like everything else. And for the first time, I accepted that some things were not mine to complete. If you're still watching and realizing how deep the truth really goes, comment number 8 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to the final chapters and uncover the ending of this story. By the time the 3rd week passed in Santa Fe, the unfamiliar had settled into something steady and recognizable. The rhythm of my days no longer felt like something I was adjusting to, but something I belonged to. I moved through each morning without hesitation, waking with the light, preparing my coffee, and stepping into my studio as though I had always been there. The space had changed along with me. What had once been an empty room now carried signs of work and intention. Canvases leaned against the walls, some finished, others still waiting. The scent of paint lingered in the air, blending with the warmth of sunlight that filled the room each afternoon. I no longer questioned whether I should be there. That uncertainty had quietly faded. I had completed more paintings in those weeks than I had in the past year. They were different, not just in style, but in feeling. There was less restraint, less hesitation in every stroke. I was no longer trying to create something perfect. I was simply creating something honest. A small gallery owner I had met earlier in the week offered to display a few of my pieces. It was not a formal exhibition, nothing that would draw attention beyond the local community, but it felt significant to me. It was not about recognition. It was about presence. For the first time, I allowed something I created to exist outside the privacy of my own space. News about Rachel reached me in fragments, never directly, always through someone else. I learned that she was struggling financially, that the situation with the property had become more complicated, and that legal issues were beginning to take shape. There were no clear details, only enough to understand that she was now facing the consequences of choices she could no longer avoid. I listened, but I did not react the way I once would have. There was a time when I would have felt compelled to step in, to offer something, to find a way to ease the situation. That instinct still existed, but it no longer controlled me. I understood now that stepping in would not change what needed to happen. It would only delay it. One afternoon, I sat at my desk and wrote a short message. It was simple, without emotion or explanation. I told her that I hoped she was safe, that I was open to speaking when she was ready to do so without demands or conditions. I did not mention money. I did not offer anything beyond that. When I finished, I read it once, then set it aside. I did not rush to send it. The act of writing it was enough. There were moments, usually in the quiet of the evening, when I thought about her and felt a soft ache settle in my chest. It was not regret, and it was not guilt. It was something gentler, a recognition of distance where closeness had once been. I accepted that feeling without trying to change it. As the sun set beyond the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape, I stood by the window and watched the light fade slowly. The silence around me no longer carried weight. It felt open, steady, and entirely my own. I had not lost what I once feared losing. I had found something I did not realize I had been missing. That evening, I sat by the window with the finished canvas resting against the wall beside me. The last light of the day stretched across the room, soft and steady, touching everything without urgency. I had grown used to this hour, the quiet transition between day and night, when nothing demanded my attention and everything simply existed as it was. I looked at the painting, noticing the layers that had built over time. There were places where I had changed direction, areas where I had covered something I no longer needed, and parts that remained exactly as they were from the beginning. It felt, in a way, like a reflection of the past few weeks of my life. For a long time, I believed that love meant giving without question. I thought that if I gave enough, if I stayed patient enough, things would find their balance on their own. I told myself that sacrifice was part of being a mother, that it was something to be accepted rather than examined. Looking back, I see how easily that belief allowed small boundaries to disappear, one at a time, until I no longer recognized where I ended and someone else began. I do not regret loving my daughter. That has never been the problem. What I did not understand, for many years, was that love without limits can become something else entirely. It can become expectation, dependency, even control, without either person fully realizing how it happened. I think about Rachel often, though not in the same way I once did. I no longer feel the urgency to fix what is broken or to step in before things fall apart. I understand now that her life belongs to her, just as mine belongs to me. The choices she has made, the consequences she now faces, are part of a path I cannot walk for her. That understanding does not remove the care I feel. It simply changes its shape. At 68, I am more aware of time than I used to be, not in a way that brings fear, but in a way that brings clarity. There are only so many years left, and I no longer see them as something to fill with obligation. They are something to live, deliberately and honestly. Leaving was not an act of escape. It was an act of recognition. I finally saw the life I had been holding back, waiting for a moment that never came. When I stepped away, I was not turning my back on my family. I was turning toward myself. The room grew dim as the sun slipped below the horizon, and I remained where I was, letting the quiet settle around me. There was no tension in it, no sense of something missing, only space and the awareness that I was exactly where I had chosen to be. For the first time in a long while, my life did not feel like something I was managing. It felt like something I was living. In the end, life has a quiet way of teaching what we often refuse to see. Love is not measured by how much we give away, but by how much truth we are willing to face. Boundaries are not walls that separate people, but lines that protect what is real and meaningful. Sometimes, the hardest decisions are not about choosing others or ourselves, but about understanding that both cannot exist without balance. Growth often arrives through discomfort, and clarity is rarely gentle when it comes. Yet within that clarity lies freedom, the kind that allows a life to be lived fully, not just endured. If this story resonated with you, thank you for being here. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more meaningful stories ahead.